Hello and welcome to the Old Garage number 24. I'm Wild Bill, and we do have a few questions, literally, and a bit of silliness, and of course a shout out, so let's get on with it. First question comes from the episode on engines, in which question from Craig Hagenbrook. Growing up, I have seen my family driving and on occasions have gone to auto shops for servicing and have been told that 300,000 is an engine's lifespan. Does this mean a complete teardown and rebuild is needed, or are they like batteries and need to be just chucked, as it would be a waste of time? Well, first of all, 300,000, is that kilometers or miles? And really, to be honest, it's hard to really give that kind of number. For one reason is it a gas engine or a diesel engine? Diesel engines do last longer. They're built more robust. They don't have ignition systems to brake. There's different, so those. I mean, I had a diesel car. I had a Mercedes 300D back in the day. Had over 750,000 miles on it. So now, if you're looking at gas cars, there are some factors that you have to keep involved when you're talking about this 300,000 magic number. Number one is that what's the design of the engine? I mean, there's engines that are built for, that you're going to have problems after 100, 150,000 miles. There's engines that are built that'll be fine after 500 or 600,000 miles, just by their design. The other thing is how well the engine and the car is maintained. Is it getting, the fluids changed, the oil, the coolant, etc. Is it being, properly maintained? That's another factor. So, any of those things can lengthen or shorten the lifespan of an engine. So, is 300? If you get an engine that gets to 300,000 miles, does it need a complete teardown and rebuild? Not necessarily. There's plenty of engines out there that you don't need to get down inside the bowels of the engine and get into the lower part and get into the crank and the piston rods and such. Sometimes they just need a little, need some valve adjustments, or maybe remill the head if they got a little hot. But I don't think that that's necessarily a legitimate rule of thumb, frankly, when it comes to engines. It really depends on the engine itself, how well the car is maintained. If you do your maintenance on your car and you don't drive it, too crazily, there's no reason why they can't go well beyond 300,000 miles or kilometers, whichever you prefer. So, no, the only time you really need to check an engine is if the block gets actual physical damage. If you blow an engine. And that, if you have a piston rod go through the crank, that's going to make the engine not repairable or not worth repairing. But most of the time, though, when an engine gets worn, it can be rebuilt, though. And so you don't necessarily have to chuck them like a battery. It just depends on what reason that the engine failed, if it's failed at all. So. At least that's my opinion. I'm sure some mechanics will be in the comments saying, "Hey, dear Wild Bill," but that's okay. Okay, I had a question off of the Old Garage from last week, and it's from Carter, and he says, "I have a question. I think you missed it last time, or maybe you thought it was a prank post, but I seriously want to know how they became to be called cars. Is it from carts? My last name happens to be Carter. Is it from that? Carters. Thank you." Well, no, it wasn't because I didn't take you seriously. It's because I usually don't look for questions on the Old Garage episodes. And so if you post one there, I typically don't see it. But in any case, actually the word car is very old. It comes from, the Middle English time, when Chaucer was writing. And it, at the time, could have meant any cart, usually of either a two-wheeled cart or a small four-wheeled vehicle that, could be not only horse-drawn, but was small enough to be pushed or pulled by a person. And the word car became really common in the vernacular through the mining industry, coal mining, in the 18th century in Britain. What they did is they made these very small, narrow gauge rail roads that would go into the mines, and then they had these small four-wheeled vehicles or cars that would run on these rails, but they were small vehicles, and you could fill them up with coal or ore or whatever, and then a person could literally just push them out of the mine, and those were called cars. When you got into the 19th century, when locomotives came around, the vehicles that were being pulled by the locomotive ended up being called cars because of the mining industry, because that's what you pull or push on a rail was a car. And over time, by the mid 19th century, car came to be a vehicle that was man-powered as opposed to horse-powered or mule-powered or whatever. And so when cars started being built as we know them, they entered in the vernacular as cars because they didn't need a horse, it just needed a driver. So you need a person, has its own engine, so it became a car because of that. Whether or not, as far as being a genealogist and knowing where the name of Carter comes from, that's I couldn't tell you, but that's pretty much where you get the term car. It's an old term, comes from hand-drawn vehicles, and then grew from there into the locomotive industry and beyond. So, okay. Now I had the last question. I only had 3 questions this whole time. Wow. And this was from the episode on Walter Christie. I get the question from Liz J. Hi, Liz. And she says, yes, I have 2 questions. When did mudguards become standard equipment on cars? And did the idea came from bicycles? At first, I thought the mudguard was adapted from the bicycle. So many of our inventors are having passed through a bicycle designing phase, and many bicycles sporting mudguards. But then I noticed some bicycles without mudguards, and that seemed contemporaneous with cars that had mudguards. So please settle these questions for me. Mudguards, also known as fenders, are ancient. What you have with mudguards are the difference between military and civilian vehicles and who those civilian vehicles and military vehicles were for. You go back to ancient Rome, chariots don't have mudguards. However, you will find that some royal coaches did. And the reason is because if you're in the military, you don't care if you're getting dirty. You just need to get out and battle fast. And putting fenders or mudguards on a vehicle is expensive. And so the only time you would have them on a vehicle was if it was a coach of some sort or carriage in which the passengers were of high social status that would get annoyed if they got mud or dirt on them from the road, and the chauffeur would be made to blame for this. And so therefore many chauffeurs would fashion mudguards, the first ones being made of leather. And you'll find they get more common by the time you get to the Renaissance and into the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. In your royal carriages and coaches, and also those of the nobility, just because they want to keep clean and keep the mud from the road off of them. You get into the 19th century, you go and look at a Brewster carriage of 1880. And it's got, mud flaps on it. It's got fenders. A Studebaker, of that era, it's got mud flaps and fenders. This is before you even really had bicycles. And so the fact that cars and bikes had mud flaps or fenders on them, it was really based on what the car was made for. If you have, or the bicycle as well, for that matter, if you have a car that is designed as a luxury vehicle to hold wealthy passengers, it's going to have mudguards on it because you don't want to get them dirty. Whereas if you have a small light car that's either to be a delivery vehicle for the local butcher, or if it's a race car that who cares how dirty you are, you just want to go fast, then it's going to have mud flaps on it. So that's really where it comes from. It's really, they were a thing of the wealthy, going all back thousands plus years. And then as cars got larger and larger, and and then of course, by the time you get after World War I, you start having actually, departments of transportation and getting actual legislation about that sort of thing. You'll see them more commonly. But it's not that bicycles, lent them, or that, to cars, or cars lent them to bicycles. They were around a lot longer. It was really an economic issue, if anything. Okay, and those are my only questions. So let's go ahead and do some silliness. Now, here's my silliness today. Now, in the modern driving world today, who here has ever done dashboard dining? Yep, I do it all the time. You sometimes, in my job, I end up, putting 200, 300, 400 miles on a car a day. So I drive a lot. So myself and my dashboard have had many meals together. And in a modern car, I mean, especially, most of them anymore are either automatic or paddle shifting or whatever. So you can just set the cruise control and steer the thing with your knees while you eat. I'm not saying that I do that. I'm not saying you should do that, but I'm just saying it is theoretically possible you could drive that way. Now, but because of this whole drain thing that I went to out in Rhode Island, I was thinking, you know what? There are a lot of foods that I eat all the time, while I'm driving, that there's no way you could eat these foods while you're driving a vintage car. So here are my Wild Bill's top 5 foods you cannot eat while driving a vintage car. Now, my number 5 food is going to be pizza. Now, the reason pizza's on this list at number 5 is because, keep in mind, when you are driving a vintage car, you're going to use all 4 of your limbs pretty much at once. And the car itself is vibrating heavily. You're shaking. And also, it has suspension that makes you feel everything on the road, whatever it is. Potholes, anthills, pebbles, doesn't matter. You're going to feel them on the road. And if you have a pizza, a nice hot slice of pizza, and you're trying to drive one of these cars, what's going to happen is that pizza is going to slide off of the dough, and you're going to end up with all the toppings in your lap. And you're trying to drive a vintage car with a slice of pizza. It ain't going to work. Don't do it. Number 4 food not to eat when driving a vintage car: sushi. Now, yes, I have driven while eating sushi, and I don't even bother with the toothpicks. At that point, it's just finger food. But the thing is that the car's vibrating so much, the sushi falls apart. It literally breaks the sushi apart when you're driving, and you have it sitting there, and of course, you've got your dipping sauce. It's going to go, it's going to splatter all over the place as well. So, sushi, it doesn't work in a vintage car. Number 3 is barbecued ribs. Now, the thing is that it's not that the ribs are hard to eat, it's just that it's hard to control where the sauce is going to go. Because you grab a rib, you munch it, you rip some meat off of that bone. Next thing you got to do, you got to start moving handles and such. And it doesn't take too much time until you have barbecued flavored car controls. And so that's why you don't want to try to do barbecued ribs while driving a vintage car. It's not going to be a good sign. Number 2, any burger from Five Guys. Now, for those of you not in the U.S. That don't know who Five Guys are, they are a burger chain out here that makes just these humongously monstrous burgers of order any whatever you want. And they're just juicy, and the thing is that you bite into one of these things and juice just goes everywhere. And let's face it, if you're in a car, that's 110, 120 years old, you don't want to get beef juice all over the leather, because then what happens is that the local cats are going to come and they're going to attack and tear up your seats because they're going to smell it. So you got to avoid that, okay? So avoid Five Guys. Okay, number 1, do not eat one of these in a vintage car, a chili cheese dog. Okay, don't do it. Just don't even start, okay? The chili is going to go everywhere. The cheese strings are going to be all over the steering wheel, which is also where your advance and retard is on your engine. So now you've got a cheesed engine. It's just, just don't do it. Do not eat a chili cheese dog. So the best advice I have for you is if you're going to eat while driving one of these cars is get a simple bologna sandwich or maybe some trail mix. Don't try to do anything more complex than that. That's the silliness for today. But I got a shout out. You're going to like this. If you have been interested at all in vintage cars by watching this channel, and if you would say, you know what, I would actually like to have a vintage car. Well, who you need to go to, if you want one, is Gavin McGuire. Now, Gavin McGuire is actually a vintage car dealer out of the UK. And the cars that I talk about, the kind of cars I talk about, yeah, you can actually buy these things. Now, if you're in the US like I am, then let you know whatever price you agree on, add a few thousand because you're going to need to get it shipped over to the US and of course pay all the customs. But if you want to have one of these cars, he has on his channel, he'll show you a short video of it. You can contact him and you can find out what it would take to actually buy a vintage car. And so that's what I have for the old garage today, and we'll see you next time. Peace.